performed differently than those downgraded for their social and governance dimension. As the drop in their share price were higher, more significant, and the share price started declining rightly after the ESG downgrade. So this could signal that ESG analysts can, to some extent, anticipate this risk, anticipate the market in identifying this risk. There is another recent study published by the Global Financial Institute, which is a think tank grouping together opinions of financial experts from Deutsche Asset and Wealth Management and academics from universities in Europe, US, and Asia. Among the result of this report, they see that ESG datasets, there is empirical evidence that ESG datasets can give the opportunity to enhance the performance of a portfolio, and that companies with higher ESG ratings tend to have higher credit rating and a lower cost of capital. I leave to the audience the reading of the report and the interpretation of the data. I recommend the reading because it also references a lot of academic studies trying to find a relationship between ESG and financial performance. What I found interesting in this report is a definition of ESG dataset that was given. As ESG dataset was labeled as a form of organizing common sense. So if you believe that climate change can have a material impact on the performance of companies in sectors particularly exposed to environmental risks like industrial or real estate, and if you believe that employees' satisfaction can have a material impact for companies operating in human-intensive sectors like ICT, or if you believe that the balance of power between investors, i.e. shareholders, and managers, as reflected in the corporate governance rule of a company, can have a material impact on the management and therefore the performance of these companies, then you will see that most of the ESG data sets present in the market now are trying to do nothing more than trying to organize all this data in an educated and quantitative way and keep track of the evolution of this data over time in order for asset owners and managers to be able to better exploit this data. Example, taking advantage of the outcome of the Milan report, an asset manager could decide to divest or reduce its exposure to a company experiencing an environmental multiple notch rating downgrade shortly after, say within 5 business days from the date of the downgrade.
This was supposed to be a round table, but it's a long table instead. But Flory is down at the end of the long table. And Flory Wilson is the international director of BLab. I think you're just back from Asia. BLabs and GIIRS, I think, mostly focuses on private companies, so that's a little bit different from the other folks on the table. So I'm hoping you can sort of draw the links between the private reporting and the private measurement and ratings to the public, and then also whatever you can share from your international experience.
Sure. Thank you. As David mentioned, I think BLab, GIIRS, and a new product that we're launching called B Analytics does target a different kind of sector of the market. So we provide ratings for entrepreneurs and private equity and venture capital funds. And then we're launching an investor-facing platform called B Analytics, which is kind of where all of the data that we collect sits. I think there are actually a lot of similarities between the methodology that we use to collect data for the enterprises that we rate and evaluate. To pick up on Jody's outline of Moody's approach, we similarly collect data that focuses on inputs, practices, and outputs of enterprises and funds, and we look at that across kind of two different areas. The first is what we call ESG, or kind of the operational impacts of a business. So we look at governance structures, their workforce, how they manage their workforce and provide benefits, training to kind of invest in those individuals, how they engage with the local community, so how they manage their supply chain, how they are involved in charitable giving, civic engagement, diversity issues within their local community, and then how they manage and mitigate their environmental footprint. But again, these are all really aspects of the company's operations or the fund's operations. And then we have a separate section of the assessment that looks at what we call the impact business model. And this is really, what is your theory of change? What is built into the DNA of the business to have positive social or environmental output or outcome? And so we look at a variety of things like the product and service provided, whether it's a socially oriented product or service like healthcare, education, access to basic services, or an environmentally focused product that relies on renewable input materials, for example. And then we look at who the beneficiaries are of that business model. So it might be the customer or client served. It may be the business's workers, so a company that's really integrated workforce development into its core business. It might be through supply chain or a micro-franchise or micro-distribution model. But ways that a company might really be trying to promote broader wealth distribution and ownership of businesses. So there are about 20 different impact business models that we consider. But again, we really look at kind of the the inputs, the practices, and the outputs of the business. Because what we're trying to do, which I think resonates with everyone in this room, is provide something that's fairly low touch. In other words, collecting data that an entrepreneur can track in a handful of hours and that they'll submit once per year, and then we'll report back up to their direct investors, fund managers, all the way up to the LPs of those funds. But a way to really streamline reporting and data collection. Where we are trying to push on the impact business model side is towards tracking longer term desired outcomes. And that's more difficult because that's where you get into, how is household income changing for your workers or for your clients? Information that's much more resource intensive to collect. And so our approach is basically to rely on academics, foundations, other organizations that really have the resources and time to do these intensive, longitudinal, outcomes-oriented studies with a control group. And one example of where that's happened and where we are able to now leverage the learnings from that is in the microfinance space, where we've had a lot of kind of multi-year outcome studies. And what we can do with that data is say, okay, we see the trends in that research that will help us identify what are the inputs, what are the practices, what are the outputs that we think are going to be the key ingredients to drive towards desired long-term outcomes. In addition to that, we also do assemble industry-specific working groups to try to get key players around the table together to coalesce around what are the core metrics that investors want to track within a specific sector or thematic investment target like poverty alleviation or gender empowerment. And then, the last thing I would say is with regard to how that data is used via this analytics platform, the analytics that we are launching, what we're hearing from a lot of investors, and this would be true of institutional investors and particularly development finance institutions, is that they're quite interested in using this data to basically extract it from our platform and plug it into their own bespoke scorecard. So in some ways it's a data collection vehicle for those individuals who might not be as interested in the rating that we provide through the GIIRS product. And I guess the last thing I would say is just how investors are wanting to use that data is, again, when we look at the information we collect on the kind of operational impacts of the business, investors are using that information more from a risk mitigation perspective. So to Aldo's point, if a company has really poor worker policies, they're going to have greater turnover and a less productive workforce on average. And so that's a potential risk that an investor might screen for. Same thing on supply chain or environmental issues. So there's both the risk component to it, as well as on the impact business model that we collect, the ability to use that data to validate an investor-specific investment mandate. So.
Terrific. I'm going to push one more time for all of you now on sort of what it all means and how you get to sort of system-level impact. Richard Kaufman gave us a good example earlier. If more households go solar or there's a lot of energy efficiency, it might have an effect over here to raise other people's rates. That presumably might not be captured in a firm-specific rating about how many homes you solarized or how much energy you saved. So is there any way that the kinds of measurements that you guys are collecting sort of gets to the whole system impact? That was a negative externality. Steve Biederman educated me earlier that that's a predictable surprise. There's also the other side of the coin, which are the positive externalities of the good that's created. You get a little bit to it in your impact business model, but those things don't often get credited or valued back to the firm, and so don't actually go into ratings. I think we've talked a little bit about how that might happen. So those are the two aspects, the system levels, and both on the negatives and the positive. How do they get baked into the kinds of ratings and measurements work you guys are doing? Anybody can take it.
I don't know if this is necessarily baked into the disclosure, but on an aggregate basis, it's meant to have a huge impact on the behavior of corporations. So if any of you guys, there's a great book called Full Disclosure by Mary Graham and some other researchers along with her. And they looked at what makes an effective disclosure system. And they measure effectiveness by, does it change the behavior of the disclosers in the intended way? And they did this research because increasingly government and regulatory agencies are using transparency and disclosure as kind of a behavior change mechanism. So anyway, they looked at different disclosure systems, and they found that the existing financial disclosure system in the US is one of the most effective, if not the most effective, in the world. In terms of what happens is companies disclose financial information to investors. Investors take that financial information and feed it back to the company in terms of capital allocation decisions. So a company has a direct feedback loop with respect to, well, how's its share price or bond yields being impacted? So what we're doing at Southie is, layering on ESG disclosure into this highly effective disclosure mechanism, into this highly effective feedback loop. And by providing investors on an aggregate basis quantified, comparable ESG data, it's audited as well, that they didn't have access to easily. I don't know if any of you guys have ever tried to really pull comparable data from CSR reports. It takes a long time. And then, I've done this exercise and it's not comparable. So, having that sort of information, that comparable data at investors' fingertips, and feeding it into this highly effective feedback mechanism, we believe that, through investor capital allocation decisions, this will have a huge impact on corporate behavior overall.
Jody?
Yeah, I think if it's going to have